There we go. So, well, welcome everyone to, as I say, Webinar Wednesday. It's January. It's the first webinar of 2019. So I suppose we should also say Happy New Year. Joined as usual by myself, Summer Mesa, and the lovely Liz Mayhew.
Afternoon, everyone.
And today we're going to be looking at redundancies and restructures, and probably quite a timely topic, this one, particularly if you're anticipating wanting to make changes that come into effect for the new academic year, and the various sort of timelines and timeframes that are associated with wanting to make changes on that scale. As ever, we're sort of going to be talking and interacting with you for sort of the best part of 3/4 of an hour or so. Hopefully the opportunity for questions as usual, and in terms of that, you'll see the friendly webinar toolbar on screen. There's a number of useful elements there. So firstly, the chat feature, which some of you are already readily familiar with, so please do sort of interact with us there, both when we throw out sort of discussion points, but also feel free to make use of that to ask any questions. If we don't get the opportunity to respond to those here live, then we do get to download a copy of those questions, and of course we'll follow up on anything separately via email. So please do make use of that feature. And the other is the materials box that you can see. There's a couple of resources in there for you that you might also find of interest. Liz, should we have a look at what we're going to cover today?
Yep, as always, a packed 45 minutes. So there you can see on screen the session overview for this afternoon. So we're going to start by looking at when a redundancy or a restructure situation might arise in a school setting and have a look at some of those drivers for change. We're then going to take a look at definitions. So what is a definition of a redundancy situation, and how does that differ from a restructure situation? Because they're similar but subtly different scenarios. Then we're going to move on and look at, if you're actually in or preparing for a redundancy process, the rationale and the consultation documents that you'll need to prepare before going on to look at the actual process and the timelines and the timescales that we follow when supporting schools through a change exercise. We'll touch on the roles and responsibilities of the different individuals who might be involved in a redundancy or restructure process, and have a think about the role of governors, because unusually for a lot of our school policies, governors play quite a significant role in redundancy processes. So it's useful to understand the remit of their role. We're then going to touch on what you might need to do if you're looking at just making minor changes to patterns of work or ways of working in your school, as opposed to a full-scale restructure, and how you might manage that. And finally finish with a look at how you might support staff effectively during periods of change, remembering that we are dealing with individuals, and it's really important to treat individuals with kind of that support and respect that they need at what can be quite a difficult time.
Absolutely. And certainly where we want to start is having an understanding of restructure versus redundancy. Often those words are used interchangeably, but actually they mean very different things, don't they, Liz?
Absolutely. If we just, before we move on to that side, we jumped one. If we just look at the drivers for change in a redundancy situation. There you go, got the slide there, jumping around. So clearly schools, like any organisation, aren't static, and the staffing needs of your school or academy may change and flex over time. And what we've learned working with schools is that there can be a wide range of drivers for those changes that need you to reflect and review how your staffing structure is organised. But on screen there, we've captured perhaps one of the most common ones for us, primarily budget pressures. Schools are under real budget pressures and have been for some time. And by far the greatest reason we see for schools needing to make redundancies or restructure are those budget demands and the need to review and refocus and place money where or prioritise your spend, which can on occasion lead to the needs to reduce the total number of staff in your school. So I think budget is probably the key driver. Alongside that, we do see schools restructuring due to operational needs. So a change may be in your pupil profile or maybe in the physical site over which you're operating. If you move on to a new school site, you might have changed or different operational needs, and these can lead you to need to restructure your staff and deploy them in a different way.
Yeah.
So that's another driver. Alongside that, there's educational or curriculum needs. Maybe that you decide, for example, to introduce an HLTA role in your school, and that might have implications for staff that are currently teaching assistants. Or likewise, you might decide to move away from having dinner ladies and introduce play workers. And those kind of changes may result in a restructure or a redundancy situation.
Yeah, I know that's affected secondaries of late, hasn't it, with some of the changes to how they're going to deliver their curriculum, particularly the post-16 options.
Yes, yeah. So it's having a look at what's upcoming on that educational horizon and being mindful of what that will mean for your staff and your staffing complements and the ultimate impact that's going to have on your staffing structure.
And also linking that to sort of external factors like declining role.
Yeah. So obviously schools aren't immune to external factors, increasing or declining role perhaps being the one that we see most commonly, bearing in mind that if you're a small school and your role declines even by 1 or 2 students, that can have a significant financial impact, which in turn then will have an impact on your ability to
maintain current staffing levels.
Staffing levels, yeah, absolutely, yeah. And then finally, wider external factors, government, DFE, legislative changes can have an impact on your staffing structures. So there are the kind of summary of the key drivers that we see when we're supporting schools in terms of why they might need to restructure.
Yeah. And then the sort of big topic item of redundancy versus restructure. Let's have a look at redundancy first, because there's quite a lot to absorb there, isn't there, and be mindful of.
Yeah, absolutely. And we often use the term redundancy and restructure interchangeably. But actually, redundancy has a very clear definition in law, in employment law. And it's one of the fair reasons that you may seek to dismiss a member of staff. So in law, a redundancy situation may arise as a result of the closure of a business as a whole. So say, for example, you're in a position where your school's closing. That would be a redundancy situation, so the closure of the business. Alternatively, a redundancy situation might arise where there's a closure of a business at a particular site, physical site. So if perhaps you work across a 2-school site, and then that operation is moved on to 1 school, that may involve the closure of a business at 1 site, and that would give rise to a redundancy situation. And then the final reason why a redundancy situation might arise is through the reduction in the requirement of employees to carry out a particular type of work or work of a particular kind. And in a school setting, that's probably the more common reason for redundancy that we come across. So a reduction, for example, in the need for teaching assistants or administrative staff or site staff. So it's not the closure of a business or the closure of a site, but it's a reduction in the requirement to have the same number of roles going forward.
Yeah, okay, lovely. So some clear guidance there around redundancy, and as you say, very specific definition within law. Probably useful for us to take a look at restructure then, so that we can be clear on both those areas.
Absolutely, and unlike redundancy, there's no legal definition of restructure, but broadly speaking, a restructure situation may arise when there's need to reorganise the operation of a school or any business, which might result in the need to change either the staffing structure or make adjustments to the roles, the job description, the grade, the hours, the pattern of work of individuals working within the organisation. And depending on the nature or the scale of the change, a restructure may also give rise to a redundancy situation. If it's a significant change, that might indicate you're looking more at a redundancy situation. But if it's a minor change, say for example, just changing the pattern of work that individuals are required to work under, that's more likely to be a restructure with no redundancies arising from that.
Okay. lot to take in there, and it's important to sort of be clear on the process that you're working to. So what we're going to do now is see what you folks think. So we've got a couple of scenarios for you. We want you to make use of the chat feature on your friendly webinar toolbar, and we're going to read out a couple of scenarios, and then you have a think and tell us whether you think it would be a redundancy or a restructure situation. Okay, so fingers on buzzers, or rather fingers on keypads, and let's talk through our first scenario. So due to a falling role and budgetary pressures, the school needs to reduce the total number of teaching assistants from 10 down to 8. Do you think that's a redundancy or a restructure situation? So make use of the chat feature and we'll talk that through.
I can hear frantic typing going on.
Okay, we've got some mixed responses. A few people punting for restructure. We've equally got some claims for redundancy. Anybody else want to offer some thoughts? And then we'll share our thinking. Okay, I think that's everybody. What are we saying in that one, Liz?
Okay, so this is your classic redundancy situation. So it's a need to reduce the number of posts, in this instance, from 10 to 8. So it's a diminution exercise in the jargon, and that's a classic redundancy scenario. So the need for work amongst teaching assistants has reduced, hence the fact you need to reduce the total number of staff in that area of work. Okay. So that's your classic redundancy.
Okie dokie, let's try another one then. So the school currently employs 3 cleaners, each of whom are working 25 hours a week. Following a review of operational requirements, the school is proposing a reduction in hours of work to 12 hours per week and a change in the accountabilities of the role. What are folks thinking, redundancy or a restructure situation? Okay, we've got a couple straight out the gate.
Yeah. Fastest fingers.
Absolutely. Okay, any more for any more? Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're good with that one. Let's reveal.
Yeah. So in essence, it is a restructure situation because you need to vary the pattern of work of these cleaners. So you want to reduce the total number of hours these cleaners are working from 25 to 12, and also look at amending their accountabilities. However, because that change is very significant, there is a potential or an argument that that could in fact also be a redundancy situation, because the role in halving the total number of hours of work, the role is very different. So there's potential there for that also to give rise to redundancy. And hopefully through that you can see how complex these scenarios can be. And when we're working with schools, we need to bottom out whether it's restructure or redundancy. Yeah. And that kind of then dictates how we manage and support through the process.
Absolutely. So if you are, when you're undertaking your reviews, you've got those drivers that are prompting change, prompting you to review structures and ways of working within your school. Do make use of our consultancy colleagues to support you in exploring the issues and whether we are looking at a restructure, redundancy, or restructure with potential for redundancy, because as Liz says, it will determine a particular way of working and a particular process. Just one to finish on. Let's have a look at this one. So the school currently employs 2 flows and they're on temporary contracts. These contracts have been running for more than 2 years and they've been funded by a specific grant, which is now coming to an end, and the school are unable to continue to fund these contracts without that grant. Is that a restructure or a redundancy situation? What do folks think? Lovely. Look at you all getting it right. Not in any way scuppered by the use of temporary contracts there.
Our red herring. Yes, so this is in fact a redundancy situation. So even though these individuals are on temporary contracts, and it would be appropriate for you to end their employment by going through what we call the 3-step process. So advising the individual that the temporary reason for their employment was coming to an end, meeting with them, giving them notice to end the contract. Even though you go through that process to end it, the fact that the need for work as a flow has ceased or diminished in this instance, would attract a redundancy payment because these individuals have more than 2 years service. So the critical thing here is the need for work has diminished, and because the individuals have got more than that 2 years service, that's a magic threshold for being entitled to a redundancy payment. And that's something to bear in mind because we're very aware how many temporary fixed-term contracts schools have in operation, and that's absolutely right and appropriate that you have those because that enables you to flex your staffing to reflect your needs. But where a contract's ending for a reason of redundancy with more than 2 years service, that would have a redundancy payment attached to it.
Absolutely. And although it's a topic for a different webinar, Liz, and in fact we've covered different contracts of employment before, this just goes to highlight the importance of keeping those contracts under review in line with your ongoing or perhaps changing staffing needs or anticipating changes in your staffing needs, and keeping those contracts under review so that absolutely you have that flexibility, but you're looking to the horizon and understanding what your future needs are, and are able to make informed decisions as early as possible to manage those staffing contracts as effectively as possible. Okay, well done, folks. Let's have a look then at our next hot topic. So we've talked about restructures and redundancy. We've got an understanding of how those processes apply to different situations and scenarios that you'll be facing within schools. I think an important thing to cover though is, in the first instance, we want to try and take actions to avoid redundancy wherever possible, don't we, Liz?
Absolutely, and there's an obligation on you to look at what we call avoidance measures, so actions you can take to either reduce or minimise the need to make staff redundant. So thinking about your setting, your context in a school, what measures could you take to help avoid redundancy situations? Do you want to use the chat feature there just to give us an indication of some of the thoughts that you might have, or some of the things in fact you may have done in the past to look at avoiding redundancies in your school?
Absolutely.
Just give you a couple of moments to note those down.
Okay, so reallocate staff to another role is one suggestion. Redeploy staff to other areas if possible and appropriate, of course. What else are we looking at? Natural wastage, absolutely.
So by natural wastage, that's a term we kind of use to describe where someone was to leave a role, instead of automatically re-recruiting to that role, delete that post from your structure at the point the person leaves.
As we've just talked about, reviewing temporary contracts, resource planning to manage natural turnover. Great suggestion, and actually again just a nod to one of our other webinars. It would have been July, where we would have looked at workforce planning and thinking about resource planning and managing those issues. Mobility clauses in multi-academy trusts.
That's a really good suggestion. Obviously, schools are increasingly working collaboratively through multi-academy trusts, and that means you do have the option, if you do have a mobility clause that allows your staff to work between schools across different sites. So when the need for staff ebbs and flows at one particular site, you have have the option to move them to another site. So that's a really good suggestion, but only where you do have those mobility clauses in your contracts.
Absolutely. And if you need advice and support on looking at those issues, again, do get in touch. Anything else that we would add into the mix, Liz, with that?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that just haven't come up. Obviously, we've talked about reviewing and ending temporary and fixed term contracts and secondments, but only where this is lawful and fair to do so. We often come across situations where schools have quite long-running temporary fixed-term contracts, maybe in excess of 4 years, and at that point it becomes a little bit harder to justify why that contract is still temporary. So I think a good first step is to look at your temporary and fixed-term contracts, see whether there are any that you can safely end for the reason they've been put in place. But if you've got contracts that are long-running, perhaps have a discussion with us about the risks involved in ending those. Another avoidance measure that schools can look at is a reduction in the use of casual staff, supply staff, overtime, additional hours. I know last year we did some work with a school, and when they looked at it, they were really surprised at how much additional time and cost they were spending over the years on all these sort of additional staffing activities, particularly additional hours and overtime. And certainly unions, one of the questions unions will be asking as part of the process is around the use of overtime and additional hours, and it's a way you can quite easily sort of shave staffing costs without significant impact.
And also demonstrate that redundancy very much is the last resort, which is certainly what unions are interested in. That actually, if you've reviewed all these areas and you've taken appropriate action, then you're demonstrating the business case quite thoroughly alongside any issues around changing of provision, curriculum, etc. That this is the best, albeit unfortunate for some, course of action.
Yeah. And of course, outside of staff-related costs, you also need to be looking at your non-staff costs. So other overheads, goods, services, supplies, contracts you have, just making sure that they're all giving you value for money, and they can be sort of pared down sufficiently, perhaps potentially to avoid redundancies.
Absolutely. So a host of ideas there that you've shared, that we're sharing on screen, things for you to think about as you move forward. In moving forward, the next big activity that they're going to be looking at after they've undertaken sort of a review and looked at measures to avoid redundancy is preparing that rationale, if that is in fact the decided course of action, isn't it, Liz?
Yeah, absolutely. And your rationale is a key document, a key planning document for a redundancy process. And it really is your business case, your statement of the reasons why you need to bring about change and how you intend to achieve those changes. So there's various aspects we would recommend including in that rationale document. And in fact, we have templates available which schools can access to help them if they're in that position, having to prepare a rationale. But the key elements you can see summarised there on screen. It's important the rationale includes a clear statement of the school's current position. So what issues is the school facing in relation to budget, operational needs, changes in role, what are the drivers for change, so encapsulate those in your consultation document. Alongside that, you want to be clearly stating what your future needs are. So how do you need your staffing structure to change? How many proposed redundancies are you considering? Are there any other proposed changes that you're looking at making as part of the process? So current position, future needs. Alongside that, you'd want to capture those avoidance measures that we've spoken about, because as we've already said, that's one of the first questions that unions will be asking around those avoidance measures. So make it clear that you've done absolutely everything you can to avoid that redundancy situation. To support you in the case you're making in a rationale, it's useful to draw on any relevant data. And we're not for 1 minute saying that you should share every detail of the school's finances, but sufficient financial information should be shared with staff and unions to enable them to understand why it is that budget is a driving force in your need to change. Likewise, if you're need to change is driven by changing roll numbers, you'd want to quote relevant data around pupil numbers. In supporting schools in managing redundancy processes, we can prepare a timeline, a timescale for your process, setting out all the key activities, and that would also be shared as part of the rationale. So staff and unions are clear what timescales you're working to. And then in preparing a rationale, you'd want to give consideration to, if you were looking at redundancies, the selection methods and criteria that you were going to use, proposing to use to bring about reduction in staffing numbers. The common process we would use in Kent is an audit, which is a bit like a reverse application form, where staff kind of state how they have the relevant skills, knowledge and experience to do the role. But there's other ways of selecting, sometimes through interviews, sometimes through the use of data. And in your rationale, you'd be wanting to comment on those selection methods. And the reason it's so important to have that rationale and have that level of detail in it is firstly in terms of making a case to governors, because before you embark on a redundancy process, it would be for the full governing body to sign off on the need to do that. So it's obviously important that they have all the information to be able to make that informed decision. It's also helpful for staff and unions to have that level of clarity as you begin consultation, so everyone's clear on that business case and the need for change.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the key things you talked about there, Liz, was timescales, and we've got something of an aid memoir to help folks think about the elements of the process, haven't we?
Yeah, obviously different schools and academies may have slightly different processes. But on the screen there, we've kind of captured the key stages in the SPS model redundancy policy, which many schools do follow. As you can see, it's a multiple kind of staged process, really that we would envisage a school starting no later maybe than 5-6 months before they need to make the redundancies. So if you're looking for redundancies in August 19 there, I'm still in last year, in August 19, really you'd want to be starting the process that's outlined there by early mid-February to give you enough time. So as we've already said, the starting point for your process would be preparing that rationale, securing governing body agreement to proceed with a redundancy process, and identifying a redundancy panel, and that's usually one or more members of your governing body. Then once you are ready to proceed, you'd be looking at convening a consultation meeting with your staff that were affected by the process, and also inviting union representatives to that meeting. You then move into a period of formal consultation, and what consultation is about is giving staff and unions an opportunity to meaningfully comment on the proposals for change that you're making. And it's really important as a school that you consider those comments carefully and see whether they impact on your rationale for change or the proposed changes that you're looking to make. So there's a formal consultation process with staff and unions, but alongside that, it's equally important that there's opportunities for individuals to meet with members of the school leadership team if they are impacted by the proposals, to discuss on a one-to-one basis how the proposals for change might impact them. So we always allow for an individual consultation meeting as part of the process. Then you're moving through into the close of consultation, considering any comments that have been made by unions, moving through into selection and notification process. Obviously, I appreciate at the moment we're kind of galloping through the process just to give you a flavour of the stages involved. Once you've identified those people that will be made redundant, you then move into representations, and representations are is an opportunity for the individuals that may have been selected for redundancy to meet with the people who've made that decision, in this case the governors, to ask them why it is they've been made redundant. There's also alongside that the opportunity to appeal against a dismissal, and then of course between that you'd be issuing notice. So you can see it's a multi-stage process, and we would suggest allowing 5-6 months sort of lead-in time for that, remembering critically that in the case of teachers you want to be ensuring that your timings coincide with the dates in the year where you can dismiss staff. And I think this is a thing that's obviously often a bit of a juggle when schools are planning redundancies. As you might know, teachers can only be made redundant at 3 points in the year. So when we're working with schools, we need to ensure that those dismissal dates tie in with either 31st of December, 30th of April, or the 31st of August. So hence the fact when we're planning the timescales, we're working around those key end dates for you.
And similarly, the issues around support staff, and obviously here we're reflecting our Kent-based colleagues and terms and conditions.
Yes, absolutely. So whereas there's only 3 points in the year where a teacher can be made redundant, support staff potentially could be made redundant at any point in the year, but obviously there are good operational reasons why you might want to lose staff at the end of an academic year or the end of a term. But if you need to, operationally you can issue notice at any point, and the notice an individual's entitled to is determined by their grade.
Yeah. For those that have joined us from other localities, then obviously it would be referring to the terms and conditions and provisions of your
absolutely
maintained staff, your local authority terms and conditions.
Yeah, the teaching provisions are national provisions, but the support staff provisions, you're right, might vary depending on where you're based.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already, very much been focused on understanding key concepts. We've linked it to policy and procedure. We've thought about sort of timelines and the operation of managing restructures and redundancies. I suppose the sort of next area, unless there are any questions, would be to look at sort of roles and responsibilities of those involved and how that sort of ties together. But let's just pause for a moment. And are there any questions? And actually, let me preface that a little bit more specifically. General questions. We wouldn't, within a webinar, want to be drawn into the detail of any live, ongoing sort of issues or cases. We're, of course, available to respond to those, but let's do that directly over the phone, where we can give you more detailed and responsive advice. But any general questions, let's pick up on a couple of those now. No? Let's give it a moment more. No? Okay, well, we'll move on to roles and responsibilities, but know that we are here for questions. So how much is a reasonable adjustment to a job description to make a post not eligible for redundancy?
Okay, oh gosh. That's a bit of a grey area, man. A grey area, indeed. We're often asked this question. In employment law, there's no hard and fast rule, but the general rule of thumb that we look to follow, that if a role is 80% the same, 75, 80% the same, that would be a restructure. If it was more than that, if the difference was greater than that, then that's more likely to be a redundancy. But what we'd be wanting to do is look at the individual case, the role, the nature of the changes before deciding whether that would be redundancy or restructure. So I think, Mandy, if you've got that situation in your school, you'd want to speak to your consultant and just explore the particular circumstances in a bit more detail there. But you won't find in employment law a role has to be X% the same or X% different.
But it's useful as a yardstick, isn't it, in terms of initial sort of thinking and helping to prompt those questions with your consultant and be exploring those issues. So thank you for sharing, and hopefully useful for everybody for us to explore that. Are there any other questions? And actually, I might take the opportunity to just have a sip of my drink here, give you the chance to tap away if there are any more, before we move into roles and responsibilities. Yeah, okay. I think we're going to be brave and we're going to move on, but know that you can always ask us questions. We'll continue to look at the chat feature as we move on. So, roles and responsibilities, Liz. Then there are a number of people involved, from governors through to union reps through to our lovely colleagues here at SPS. So let's have a look at that.
Yeah, should we start with governors? Because unlike many school policies, governors do have quite a significant role in the redundancy, the operation of the redundancy policy. So initially, before you kick off a redundancy process, it's the role of the full governing body to approve your business case or rationale, to agree that the school is in a position where it needs to contemplate redundancies. And the reason it's so important to have that full governing body sign off is to ensure that everyone's sort of singing from the same hymn sheet, and that from strategic level through to operational level, governors and the head teacher are in agreement about the need to proceed. So that rationale sign-off is done by the full governing body, and as part of that sign-off, governors would then delegate the management of the redundancy process to a smaller panel of governors. Usually that's 3, but it could be 1 or 2 governors, and they would have that delegated responsibility to manage all the stages in the redundancy process that we actually looked at on the preceding slide. So they would be responsible, for example, for considering any comments that came back from staff or unions as part of the consultation process. They'd also be responsible for making any selection decisions. So in this instance, it's not the head teacher who decides who's made redundant. It's governors who would look at whatever selection criteria the school had identified, and the governors on the redundancy subcommittee would make that decision about which staff are to be made redundant. And then alongside that redundancy subcommittee panel, you'd also have a separate panel of governors who would be available to hear any appeals against dismissal. Again, and that could be a panel from 1 to 3 members. So you can see a redundancy process does require quite significant involvement on the part of members of the governing body.
And I think something there, when you talked about the timeline before, something else probably to be mindful of, folks, is the knowledge and experience of your governors, if they're going to be involved and heavily involved at varying stages of this process, that they have an understanding of the nature of their role, the policy, the processes that they're going to be called to be part of.
Yeah, absolutely. I certainly think it's worth kind of investing in upskilling your governors in that area, or looking at governors who have relevant experience perhaps to be on a redundancy panel. We have colleagues in SPS who are actually governors in schools, and quite often they fulfil roles on redundancy panels because they can bring that extra expertise to the process.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Should we have a look at the role of the head teacher?
Go on then.
Okay, so the head teacher, I guess, is you describe them as the professional advisor to the process. So they don't make decisions around redundancy, but obviously they are the person driving the need for change. They're likely to be the ones that prepare the business rationale, present the case for change initially to governors, and then also to staff during the consultation process, and kind of represent the school at that consultation meeting. They're not involved in the selection of staff for redundancy, but they might give professional or technical advice to governors on what the school needs going forward in terms of skills, knowledge and expertise. So that's the role of the head teacher. And then alongside that, we have workplace colleagues or union representatives. So in redundancy processes, union reps kind of have a formal role in that they're invited to attend consultation meetings where redundancy proposals are discussed, either whole school consultation meetings, or they may also, at the employee's request, attend individual consultation meetings to provide support to their member. They'd also have an involvement, should an individual be made redundant, in any appeal meeting. They could support their member at the appeal as well. And of course, just to note there, if an employee isn't in a union, then they're entitled to bring a workplace colleague to all those meetings who would fulfil the same role.
Yeah.
And then finally, SPS. Obviously, we fully appreciate how complex and difficult redundancy and restructure processes can be. So we're there to kind of hold your hand all the way through the process, supporting you with the preparation of documentation, attending relevant meetings, advising you on process or employment law kind of points that arise from the meeting. And we can provide support both to the head teacher but also to governors. So if governors are hearing redundancy appeals, we can support and advise at that stage as well.
Absolutely. So do make use of your the fourth emergency service that is SPS, and obviously we'd be more than happy to help. We've talked a lot about restructures and redundancies, but at the top of the webinar we also talked about more minor changes, didn't we, and how schools can look to manage those, action those. So let's just take a moment to sort of round off discussions and also think about those smaller, more minor changes.
Yeah, so often it might be possible to make small contractual changes without the need for a formal consultation process, as we've just described. So the kind of things that might be sort of suitable for that sort of informal conversation would be minor changes around a pattern of work. So where an individual's total number of hours didn't change, but the pattern of work you were requiring them to work altered. That might be something that you could affect through an informal conversation with the individual. Likewise, changes to break time, start or end times of work. All of those might be achieved through an informal discussion with the affected staff with a view to reaching agreement. However, where the change is significant or the employee is likely to be at a detriment, we'd always advise that formal consultation process, and your consultant could advise you on the precise sort of shape and nature of that consultation, because it is possible where there are no redundancies to adopt a slightly different consultation process that's shorter than the full process we've outlined today.
Absolutely. Just reflecting on where we're at, and I suppose just coming back to redundancy for a brief moment, one of the other important things to think about is pension costs and actually the redundancy costs themselves, isn't it?
Yes, clearly there's a cost involved in making staff redundant if they're entitled to a redundancy payment, and also potentially a cost if you're making support staff redundant who might be eligible to access their local government pension. So if we just kind of have a look at redundancy, a redundancy payment is based on an individual's actual salary in accordance with our policy. So obviously, where a person has a higher salary, potentially their redundancy payment is going to be higher. A redundancy payment is payable where an employee has 2 years local government continuous service. So that's not just service with your own school, but if an individual has moved to your school from another school without breaking employment, all that service is counted when you're looking at their redundancy entitlement. And often that's a potential hidden cost to schools. It's only when you start looking at someone's service you realise that they've got previous service that needs to be factored into the redundancy payment. In terms of how we calculate redundancy pay, an individual will be entitled to 1 week's pay for each complete year of service up to the age of 41 and 1.5 weeks pay thereafter. And that's payable on a maximum of 20 years service. And through experience, we know the number of longer serving staff there are in Kent schools, where it's quite possible you will be paying on service up to 20 years, particularly where someone's moved between different local government employment over that time. So if you're an academy, the expectation is that you would fund any redundancy costs yourself. If you're a maintained school, so community controlled voluntary aided foundation, it is possible to make an application to KCC Schools Financial Services for funding of redundancy costs. They have quite stringent criteria and are really focusing their support on schools that are in perilous financial situations. So it would be about making a case to them as to what your budget position was to see whether they would support funding there. In terms of local government pension, again, this is often a hidden cost that schools aren't aware of. If you've got a member of support staff and they're over 55 at the date they're made redundant, and if they're an active scheme member, so they're paying into the pension scheme, they're required to take their pension at the date they're made redundant. It's not an optional or a discretionary decision, it's a requirement. And because through that an individual is receiving their pension potentially for up to 10 years longer than they would receive it under normal circumstances, there are costs to the school involved in that early release. If KCC Finance have agreed to support the redundancy costs, it's likely they'll also agree to support you with the pension costs, but it's by no means guaranteed. And again, if you're an academy, you would be responsible for meeting the costs yourself. So clearly financial implications all round to be considered.
Yeah. And really important to have the opportunity to anticipate those before you move into a process, because it's not unheard of for schools to start merrily along the way of a redundancy, realise that actually redundancy is in itself financially prohibitive because of the costs involved, and then that's a really challenging situation to unpick. And manage both from a practical point of view, but also in terms of the impact on individuals that are part of that process. So do look to explore those issues before setting out on a course of action. I noticed that we've had a couple of questions come in. Just going to take an opportunity to have a quick look at those and see whether we've got time to respond to those now, or whether those are questions we're going to pick up a little bit later.
Yeah, so Sam's asked a question about timelines for restructures as opposed to redundancies. It is possible to follow a slightly shortened timeline for a restructure process where you're confident no redundancies are going to arise as part of that. So rather than having the multiple stages of early and formal consultation, you might just go into a straight consultation a meeting, and you may not allow for representations either, and possibly even appeals. But what I would really suggest, if you're in that situation, speak to your consultant and they can work up a timeline that's appropriate for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And then another question from our academy colleagues, and very much thinking about the issue of continuous service, Liz, as you mentioned, in terms of the impact that could have on redundancy payments and service that they bring with them. So let's just have a look at that.
Yeah, no, I've just seen the query there. Yeah, so the query relates to academies and recognising service from other academies, potentially, that would then count as continuous towards a redundancy payment. In terms of redundancy entitlement, it's covered by something called the modification order. So all employment in maintained schools and academies, not independent schools, not private schools, but maintained schools and academies, all that employment counts towards your service for a potential redundancy entitlement. So even if in your own academy contract you state that you recognise service from the start of their employment with your academy, for the purposes of redundancy and redundancy legislation, it's all continuous employment in maintained schools, regardless of what you might state in your contract.
Okay.
Continuous service is a hugely complex area, and certain things are recognised for certain contractual purposes and not for others. But in case of redundancy, the modification order, if you like, top trumps everything else, and all service in academies and maintained schools is recognised.
Okay,
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, brilliant question, and well worth colleagues thinking about that. So thank you. Okay, we are fast approaching sort of the end of our session. The last thing that we wanted to have a look at, other than to cover a last minute question, well done you for shoehorning that in there, thinking about breaks in service, and then we're going to talk about support.
Yes. Now, for the purposes of redundancy, I think we generally say a break of more than a week would break service. But again, it's looking at the kind of circumstances under which that break has occurred. I think we'd want to look on a kind of case-by-case basis where someone's got a break, as to whether we regarded that as a true break or not. So again, speak to your consultant and we can have a look into that.
Lovely. Okay, I am going to take that as sort of the last question for the moment. Let's look at another important issue and thinking about supporting staff during periods of change. I think that's really important for, firstly, those involved in the process. In fact, I think it's critical for those involved in the process, but also being mindful that the rest of the staffing body, although they're not directly impacted, will also have on their periphery colleagues that are involved. How is the school managing that? And it will affect their sense of morale as well, won't it?
Yeah, we often hear about survivor kind of syndrome, don't we, in terms of redundancy process being equally challenging and hard, but in a different way for staff that remain in employment, and equally for managers who have to deliver difficult messages around staff being made redundant. I think that we've learned a few things over the years from supporting schools in terms of how they can better support staff during periods of change. I think good communication is absolutely key. Open, transparent communication, being as upfront and honest with staff as you possibly can about the needs for change and the process. A kind of open door policy as far as you can in terms of sharing information and making sure any information is shared in a clear and timely manner.
Yeah, I think that notion of timely is really important, and particularly not just timely in terms of the speed and frequency at which you're communicating with staff, but also quite literally the timing of communication. Do you want to deliver a difficult message, close of play on a Friday, leaving staff to go and wrestle with that information without support from management, without support of colleagues over the weekend, where you're not able to maybe manage some of the messages, potential for miscommunication, potential for concerns and angst to build over that period, and have everybody walk into school on Monday morning having perhaps festered a little bit over the weekend. So also thinking about the timing of messages, I think, is really important.
Yeah, and how best to share a message. Is it more appropriate to do it in a group setting, a one-to-one setting, by letter, face-to-face? There's options and decisions to be made. Obviously, any formal decision ultimately would have to be confirmed in writing. Yeah. But remembering you're dealing with people, and I always like to think, well, how would I like to be treated in that situation? And I think for me, the opportunity to speak one-to-one to someone about any concerns I had during a process like this would be really, really important.
Yeah.
So that's kind of during the process. And then I think for individuals who might be selected for redundancy, there's a few kind of practical steps schools may like to consider. Signposting their support from a counselling service, remembering staff care services can provide that function, or schools might have their own counselling support in-house. Practical support with got duplication there, apologies, I've just noticed. Practical support with CV writing, job hunting skills, recognising that if someone is selected for redundancy, they may have been out of the job hunting market for some time and might need support to kind of refresh their skills in that area. And then if someone is seeking alternative employment elsewhere, granting them reasonable time off to attend interviews connected with that job hunt. And that's actually a legal provision to make sure you allow for that reasonable time off.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly for our purposes, we've put together a wealth of materials and support, both for management colleagues and governors in terms of that upskilling piece, in terms of enabling them to effectively manage and oversee these processes, but also perhaps more importantly, support for those directly impacted, those staff, and a series of sort of workshops that gives advice and guidance and support to staff seeking their next role. And actually that support is really well received. So if there is interest in that, then please do get in touch. Having worked with more than 100 staff just in sort of the last few months of last year, year, it's definitely something that has a real and in some instances quite a profound impact on individuals as they look to secure employment elsewhere. Any final questions? You've asked a number as we've gone through the webinar, and I hope our advice and support has been useful. Certainly some very detailed questions, which is great in terms of giving you really specific advice around some key issues. Any last questions that you have? Of course, you know where we are if you need us, but anything else that you want to ask at this point? Probably limit it to just a couple of questions. Okay, so can we?
Hundreds are coming in.
Okay, a good few have come through. Okay, there's a cheeky third, but it's quick and easy, so we will definitely deal with that. Can we clarify what costs are involved for pensions for those over 55?
Okay, so there's not a set formula that we can give you in terms of what those costs are likely to be. There's various elements that go into the cost. Critically, how far away from 65 the individual is in terms of their age. So if they're 55, you're paying for the pension to be in payment for up to 10 years longer than it would normally be. So the younger the employee, generally the more expensive it will be. The grade of the individual, how much service they've got, whether they've brought in any funds from other pension pots into the LGPS can all impact on the cost. So it's not a set formula, but what LGPS are able to do for you are cost only estimates. So where you're thinking about a redundancy process and you know you've got staff over the age of 55 and you want an indication of the costs, you can provide them with a list of staff details and they will produce cost only estimates to give you an indication of what that means financially. But unfortunately there's not a formula that I can give you to say it will be this amount.
Yeah, okay, hopefully that's useful though in terms of absolutely making use of the support and departments that are around you and sources of helpful information as you move forward with these processes. And then the last couple of questions that we had through is, can you have a copy of these slides? What do you reckon, Liz? Should we be kind to...
Well, I think we could.
Our webinaries. Go on then. Well, we've got details of those that have attended this afternoon. What I will do is when we get back to base, I will send you all an email and I will include a copy of these slides. Hopefully that is an indication that this afternoon has been really useful for you. Certainly we hope so. And actually on that note, if you have found it useful, if you are finding our webinar series really useful and recognise the second Wednesday of the month is the place to be in terms of joining us for the varied HR hot topics that we review, please do tell colleagues about it, because we would like to continue this series, but we can only continue all the while there is a viable audience to broadcast to. So great that we've got a number of you joining us today. We'd like to continue delivering these and we want to see that audience grow. So please do share with colleagues.
And also to add there, Summer, we do upload the webinars to, it's a YouTube site, is it?
Yeah, we upload them to...
if you can't attend live, you can always listen in at another point.
Watch back. Yeah, we upload them to the website. There's been a little delay in terms of December's webinar video. So when we look to upload this month, we'll get a couple of back catalogues up on there as well. But do visit the website because absolutely you'll be able to see previous content. And of course, equally visit the website because you'll be able to see future topics as well. And on that note, just to give you a bit of a sneaky peek if you haven't already seen it on the website. Next month, we'll be looking at the characteristics of an effective appraisal process. So if that's of interest, do check that out. March, we'll be looking at employment contracts. So remembering when we talked about early on in the session about, the varied flexible contracts that you might make use of, fixed term contracts, temporary contracts, supply, casual staff, enabling you to be agile and flexible in how you meet the needs, the staffing needs of your school. We're going to be doing a webinar that will unpick those different contracts, the pros and issues that you need to think about in using those, when you're best placed to make use of those, how you need to ensure that you manage those correctly, and some of the issues that you need to be mindful of. So make a note of March if that's of interest. And April, we'll look at an employment law update. April and October being key dates in the employment law calendar. So we'll have a look at what's changed in employment law as a result. So training, as ever, we offer a suite of training to support you, your managers within schools, senior leadership, etc., to be able to deal with all manner of staffing issues. So check out our website. In fact, if you look at the materials section of the Friendly Webinar toolbar, there's some helpful information that we've squirreled away in there for you. And I guess that kind of leaves us to say, I guess thank you for joining us this afternoon. I think a really useful discussion about quite a complex area, and hopefully we've helped to make some sense of it for you and provide some helpful advice and guidance along the way. Do join us for the future, and have a great rest of the afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.